We're all learning this morning that journalists Don Lemon and Georgia Fort and longtime activists Traherne Cruz and Jamel Lundy were arrested at the direction of Pam Bondi, and they are going to face charges in federal court. The internet is outraged over this. Everybody should be outraged over this. This is a direct attack on freedom of the press, on the First Amendment, as well as clearly, obviously, an attack on Black Americans. Make no mistake, this is all about intimidating the press and chilling dissent, making journalists afraid to cover the crimes that the administration is committing, the horrors that the regime is carrying out, the people who are complicit, collaborating with the rise of fascism in the United States, as well as the resistance movement, as well as the huge groundswell of Americans who are actively defending the Constitution, our immigrant neighbors, our communities, and our rights. Only an authoritarian government is intimidated by journalism, by the freedom of the press. And the only response when a would-be authoritarian is attacking our rights is to vigorously exercise those rights. If they're coming for the First Amendment, cool, we need to all be out in the streets exercising our First Amendment rights. The absolute wrong thing to do in this moment is to go hide in your home, is for journalists to cease to cover what is happening, is to in any way hand over the First Amendment. Because what they're doing right now is seeing if they can grab the freedom of the press and steal it for themselves and make it go poof, make it no longer exist. The way authoritarians advance their terrible, awful plan is they try to claim a right that they do not have, and they wait to see if the people push back. And if the people don't push back, they now say, hey, we took this right from you, we put it in our pocket, and you don't have it anymore. Right? They started this way last year with due process rights for immigrants, and they're working their way through the list to see how many rights they can steal from us and to see if we push back. So they tried to bring these charges against Don Lemon and Georgia Fort, and a judge was like, fuck off. No, there's no probable cause. These are journalists. They were acting in their journalistic capacity, and no, you can't charge them. It went to an appeals court, and the judges on the appeals court said, yeah, we can't force this magistrate judge to bring these charges, except for one Trumper judge on the appeals court said, hey, Pam Bondi, you could just send this to a grand jury and see if they indict. So what we're hearing now, Georgia Fort said last night before she was arrested, that she was told that a grand jury indicted her and also Don Lemon. So when a judge who was a former clerk for Antonin Scalia and was appointed by George Bush said there was no probable cause to charge these journalists, Pam Bondi went shopping around for another way that she could intimidate them. This is a weaponization of the Department of Justice. And the correct response from all of us is mass public outrage. We got to get serious. We got to get serious about big disruptive actions, y'all, immediately. As Slate said, an attack on journalists is a 5-alarm fire. And I realize the headline right now is that Don Lemon has been arrested and is facing charges under the FACE Act. But it's equally, if not more important, that we sound the alarm that local journalist Georgia Fort was also arrested and apparently indicted by a grand jury, because it is local journalists who are doing all of the important work on the ground that is helping all of us understand the depth of the cruelty and the illegality of the regime, and all of the small ways that regular, ordinary Americans are resisting. The regime doesn't want you to know that anybody is resisting. They don't want you to hear those stories of courageous, ordinary people and the way that we are organizing and resisting. An attack against Georgia Fort, the arrest of Georgia Fort, that is meant to make local journalists who have fewer resources. They don't have Don Lemon's massive quantities of resources and high-powered attorneys. They're trying to make local journalists in particular scared to cover what's happening, especially make them scared to cover the resistance. So I'm not an attorney, but my understanding is that they are trying to charge them under the FACE Act of 1994, which is the freedom of access for clinic entrances, but it also covers churches. And when I woke up this morning, I saw a number of my mutuals had already covered this story, and man, their comments are full of right-wing bots, full of them. The disinformation and propaganda machine of the regime is full throttle right now, y'all. They are desperate to push their narrative on this because what they're doing is a direct attack on the Constitution, a direct attack on the press. It's reprehensible. It's like straight up authoritarianism. Again, remember, Pam Bondi already tried to have Don Lemon and Georgia Fort charged, and a magistrate judge was like, no, there's no probable cause here. They're journalists. So she went this grand jury route. This is a good time to remind everybody that jury nullification is a way that we defend democracy. It's a power that the people have to defend democracy against a weaponized federal government, against a weaponized Department of Justice. So the FACE Act makes it a crime to physically obstruct or intentionally injure intimidate or interfere with any person attempting to gain access for reproductive health services or a site of worship. But interfere with means restrict a person's freedom of movement. And intimidate means to place a person in reasonable apprehension of bodily harm. So I'm not really sure where journalists asking questions and interviewing people who are willingly engaging in interviews, I'm not sure where that falls under any of this. So I'm not really sure. I know a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich, but I'm not really sure how it is that a grand jury has agreed to indict these folks. The judge said there is no evidence that these two engaged in any criminal behavior or conspired to do so. When a would-be authoritarian comes for your constitutional rights, the only response that works, that protects us, is mass, vigorous pushback from the people. There are protests and boycotts today and tomorrow. Find your local grassroots group, find your local protest, and show up. I also want to take a moment here and mention the irony and the cruelty of the regime using the FACE Act of 1994 to charge journalists, Don Lemon and Georgia Fort, as well as the two other activists. That's because in March and April of last year, there was a big push from Republicans to repeal the SAVE Act. In fact, it's on the Heritage Foundation's list of laws that they want repealed, they want done away with, because it protects reproductive health care clinics from being attacked. It protects people trying to get access to those clinics from being obstructed and harmed. And so because right-wing anti-abortion folks want to be able to do that, they want to be able to obstruct people from accessing care, they want this law repealed. Reproductive rights organizations sounded the alarm last year pretty vigorously. I know we were all overwhelmed with an awful lot of other things in March and April as Congress was considering repealing the SAVE Act. And I do think maybe that's part of the reason that they're using it now. Because fashy lawyers on the right and for the Heritage Foundation have been digging deep in an attempt to get rid of it. And now they're like, oh, well, we can use this provision to trump up charges against journalists and activists. The regime is trying to paint the protest that happened at the church in St. Paul as a violent riot. In fact, they're calling it the St. Paul church riots. It was an entirely nonviolent direct action, and there were journalists and producers for those journalists on site to interview, to document what the protesters were doing, and to interview members of the church who freely spoke with Don Lemon. None of the protesters were putting people in reasonable apprehension of bodily harm. None of the protesters were restricting anybody's freedom of movement. Nobody was infringing on their right to practice their religion. We know these charges are BS. That's not the point in many respects. The point is that they are trying to say we can twist and use and manipulate laws on the books to imprison anybody we want for anything that we want. The law has no meaning anymore. Justice has no meaning anymore. The DOJ is entirely Donald Trump's weaponized personal retribution machine. And that we, the regime, will use it to chill dissent. We will use it to scare you into giving up your rights. We only have rights if we exercise them. We only have the Constitution if we defend it. For every smart, good attorney we have on our side trying to uphold the rule of law, they've got attorneys on their side who are trying to figure out how they can use the law to advance authoritarianism and to oppress the American people. It is not a coincidence that they went for Black journalists. It is not a coincidence that they are coming for journalists and the freedom of the press. They don't want us to know what is happening. They don't want us to know and document and see the illegal things that the regime is doing. And they really, really, really do not want us to know about the ways that people are resisting effectively so that we can draw encouragement from them, so that we can support them, so that we can copy what they're doing. Big media organizations, particularly CBS and Fox News, they are just a propaganda wing of the regime. They're not doing journalism. All corporate media has underreported protests, dissent, and the grassroots resistance movement across the U.S. They want us to seem smaller than we are. They want people to think that nobody here is resisting. They want you to think if you want to stand up for your rights, you're the only person doing it. They don't want the pillars of support to know how many people are actively involved in sustained resistance. So they come for journalists who are covering that resistance. And the only way that we stop them is that we resist harder. We stay the course. We continue to organize. We don't allow them to scare us and intimidate us, because remember, these are desperate acts of a desperately weak regime. They're trying to scare you into giving up. They can't actually take away your rights. All they can do is intimidate you into handing them over, and we will not be doing that. The correct response to this action is mass civil resistance.